Hello again, Connecting Point, and today we're picking it up at 2 Samuel chapter 11, which is undoubtedly a very dark chapter in David's life, in King David's life. But I'd like to start off with this table talk, and that is, why do you think people who love God and are committed followers of Jesus are still tempted by sinful things? Take a minute, think about that, and then we'll come back. We're going to begin in verse 1 of this chapter, and we'll end up reading the whole thing, but we'll read it bit by bit, and we'll kind of just talk our way through it and come to some kind of conclusion. So let's start with the first part of verse 1, and it begins with this phrase, "in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war." And so it's giving us the setting. And see, it was the responsibility of the king to provide resources for his people, as there were different tribes and different nations around, a lot of them competing for the same resources, whether that be water or land, as well as protect them from their enemies, or protect those that would come against them to acquire resources. It was expected that the king would be a mighty warrior. That was part of his job. In Israel's case, it was expected not only that the king would be a mighty warrior, but also a pious follower of Yahweh, because faithfulness to God was associated with success in battle. And even in their writings, in the ancient Hebrews' writings, the works of God were often described in military terms, in terms of victory against the enemies of God. And if you want to see that, you can look at Psalm 18, which is also printed in 2 Samuel 22, which in a number of weeks from now we will get to that. But you can check that out, how they spoke of God as being the one who's victorious, the one who defeated our enemies, and they often speak of God in military terms. Kings went off to war to protect what they had, their land, their resources, but also to acquire more resources as their populations may have been growing or whatever they needed, and also to establish superiority over their rivals in a region, and kind of, to create the pecking order, and also to battle with those whom with they had long-standing historical feuds. And so there's all this going on in these times. And spring was the time when they would fight, because it was after they planted and it was before they harvested, so they had the men available to arm and to fight. And so as a great protector and warrior, it was expected that David would lead Israel's army against their rivals. So let's pick it up in the next part of verse 1. It says, David sent, so in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. And they destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. So as Tyler pointed out last week, David had already done this once, meaning that he had sent Joab, who was the general of his army. He sent Joab out with the army to fight the Ammonites while David hung back. In chapter 10, Israel had defeated the Arameans, who were allied with the Ammonites. Tyler described that battle in detail last week. And now, in this spring, they were going to finish up with the Ammonites, who were resurging. So while the men of Jerusalem and men of Israel were at war under the leadership of Joab, David chose to stay in Jerusalem, putting himself in what turned out to be a compromising situation. So rather than focusing on the task at hand, David is relaxing and living comfortably in Jerusalem, and he leaves himself vulnerable. Verse 2, one evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof he saw a woman bathing. This woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David, saying, "I am pregnant." Well, let's begin to look at this text with what we know about Bathsheba, because it's quite important, some of the details of who she is. First of all, we find out she's the daughter of Eliam, who is one of David's elite warriors, one of the top 30 described in 2 Samuel 23, particularly verse 34. She is also the wife of Uriah, who is also listed in chapter 23 in verse 39, and he is also one of David's elite warriors. On top of this, she's the granddaughter of Ahithophel, one of David's most trusted counselors. And that's also in 2 Samuel 23. We find that out in verse 34 in the reference to Eliam. It's important to know that the legal context for this story in Israel's law is Deuteronomy 22:22, which says, "If a man is found sleeping with another man's wife, both the man who slept with her and the woman must die. You must purge the evil from Israel." So what David did was a capital offense. So as we look at this, we see verse 2. And the reason I mention that is it kind of hangs over the whole story. This is the consequence, the possible consequence that hangs over this whole story of David. Verse 2, David is tempted when he sees Bathsheba. So he's walking around on the palace roof, and likely one of the highest, if not the highest place in Jerusalem, and he has a great view of everything from there, and he sees Bathsheba. And when he is tempted by what he sees, in verse 3 and 4, David gives in to his flesh, and he makes inquiries, and he follows through with his lust. The Apostle John in 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 to 17 wrote this, "Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. For everything in the world," and then there's this list, "the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever." So, back to 2 Samuel in verses 2 to 5, we see David unsuccessfully dealing with the lust of his eyes and his flesh. And then as we follow the rest of the story, verse 6 and on, we will see how his pride motivates him to go to deadly lengths to cover up his action. But before we get there, I want you to consider this question: what tools has the Holy Spirit provided us with to deal with temptation? I'll give you a few minutes to think about that. So far, David has given into his temptation and his lust and has committed adultery with Bathsheba. And he obviously feels guilt and understands how wrong this is. And we can tell that by his actions starting in verse 6. Because what he does now in the rest of this chapter is try to cover up his actions. So let's start in verse 6. So David sent this word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent him to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to the house and wash your feet." So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants, and did not go down to his house. David was told Uriah did not go home, so he asked Uriah, "Haven't you just come from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." So here we have David's first attempt to cover up his sin. His actions betray that he knows that he is guilty of wrongdoing. David has done wrong. He knows he has done wrong, and yet he deceives himself into thinking that he can cover it up. David creates the opportunity for Uriah to go home to Bathsheba, so it would appear that Uriah was the father of the child that Bathsheba was expecting. And this is all implied in the language. Go down to your house, wash your feet, clean yourself up, make yourself acceptable. And he also sent him gifts and all kinds of stuff to create just the right circumstances. And in Uriah's response, we can't help but notice the contrast between David and Uriah in this story. For Uriah, enjoying the pleasures of home amounted to betraying his brothers, toughing it out on the battlefield. Whereas, when we look at David, what was he doing? Wandering around in his palace, taking in the view, enjoying life, and not really identifying with his men, even as much as Uriah was identifying with the men that were out in the battle. And so because of Uriah's convictions and his values and his commitment to not betray his fellow soldiers, David's first cover-up attempt failed. So let me pick it up in verse 12. Then David said to Uriah, "Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants, and he did not go home. So David doubles down his efforts by getting Uriah drunk. But this also failed. Uriah, even though in a drunken state, still did not compromise his values. This really leaves David in a conundrum. So in verse 14 then, in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it he wrote, "Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die." So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. Joab sent David a full account of the battle. He instructed the messenger, "When you have finished giving the king this account of the battle, the king's anger may flare up, and he may ask you, 'Why did you get so close to the city to fight? Didn't you know they would shoot arrows from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubbesheth? Didn't a woman drop an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died in Thebez?'" This is a reference back to Judges chapter 9, particularly verse 52, when Abimelech was at war and he got too close to a tower, and a woman dropped a millstone and cracked his head. And so this has become a bit of a legend in Israel, and kind of how not to do war. So there was reason for the king to get angry. Why did he get so close to the wall? If he asks you this, then say to him, moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead. The messenger set out, and when he arrived, he told David everything Joab had sent him to say. The messenger said to David, the men overpowered us and came out against us in the open, but we drove them back to the entrance of the city gate. Then the archers shot arrows at your servants from the wall, and some of the king's men died. Moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead. David told the messenger, say this to Joab, don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. Press the attack against the city and destroy it. Say this to encourage Joab. So we get to a place where the only option that David sees at this point is that Uriah must die. This is not an easy task. Remember, Uriah is among the toughest men in Israel. So you can't really just send him back to the front and along the way he accidentally goes missing, or do something like this, because Uriah is going to defend himself, and it's not going to go well for whoever is put in charge of doing that. So he comes up with this other plan. He devises a plan by sending the message to Joab with a scheme for Uriah to die in battle, which would seem much more of an occurrence that is likely. The irony here is that Uriah, who would not betray Joab and his brother warriors, is betrayed by his king and his general. So the sin just keeps getting deeper. David just keeps digging a deeper hole. And not only did Uriah die because of these actions, but others as well. He wasn't the only one that was a victim of this plan. But to avoid arousing suspicion, even though Joab probably doesn't know what's really going on, but he goes, well, the king must have his reasons. To avoid arousing any suspicion around the king, Joab prepared the messenger who carried the news of Uriah's death with the warning that the king may become angry because of their lousy military tactics. And if or when this happens, then tell the king, Uriah is dead. That will fix everything. As it turns out, in our text, David did not get angry, or even pretend to be angry. Rather, he basically treats the whole thing quite casually. And essentially what he says is, well, you win some, you lose some. Tell Joab to finish the job. Give him some encouragement. At this point, you might wonder what the messenger may have been thinking. That just was something that kind of went fleetingly through my mind, like, is this messenger picking up on something fishy going on? But we're not told that. What we see demonstrated in this dark chapter of David's life is how committing a sin may seem like a solitary act in a moment in time. However, this is not the case. There are the obvious things. David's act of adultery has immediate consequences for Bathsheba. Now she has a pregnancy that she needs to explain, and David needs to explain. David's subsequent actions compromise the military effort. First of all, they're in the heat of a battle. Why on earth would the king send for Uriah, one of the great warriors in Israel, and reduce him to the role of a messenger? And that's essentially what he did. Send for Uriah, I need a report on the battle. That's not Uriah's place. So right away, he's taking, one of the big dogs out of the battle, and that compromises their strength. And in the end, Uriah, along with others, should not have had to die because of a wicked scheme to betray him. And Uriah becomes a victim in this story in several ways. But it wasn't just him. There was others along with Uriah that died needlessly because of this scheme of David's. Also, David's actions would have long-term consequences. Remember Ahithophel, the grandfather of Bathsheba and one of David's trusted advisors? Well, later on we're going to find out that he turns against David when David's son Absalom leads a rebellion. Ahithophel became an advisor to Absalom. You can read about that in 2 Samuel 17. So he has one of his own trusted advisors turn against him. Is it connected to this whole sordid affair with the fate of Uriah? So participating in sin has the consequence of leading us down a path of more sin and more devastation. Next week in chapter 12 we will see other consequences not mentioned here. We're not going to steal all that thunder. But there are other consequences to David's sin that have far-reaching effect. Sin also results in relational collateral damage. David's relationship with God, his relationships within his family, his relationships with those under his command, as well as compromising his own integrity, or his integrity on a personal as well as a political level, all resulted in serious damage. And the lesson here is that sin is never isolated or harmless. The chapter ends like this: when Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. This is about the most information we're given in terms of Bathsheba's, emotional well-being is mentioned here in 26. I think the reason for that is that the author here is pinning this sin on David. He's really pointing out this is David's thing. After the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. The final word in this chapter that summarizes David's actions is the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Thankfully, this is not the final word on David's life. Next week we dig deeper when we cover 2 Samuel chapter 12. But with this dark chapter of David's life in mind, I would like to end our time with a meditation from the Apostle Paul in Colossians chapter 3, the first 14 verses, and then a final table talk, and then we'll be done. But with this idea of temptation, sin, the consequences of sin in mind, listen to what the Apostle Paul says here. Since then you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. You used to walk in these ways, in the life you once lived. But now you must also rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices and put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its Creator. Here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other, and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you, and over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. To end our time today, consider these questions. How do you go about putting to death whatever belongs to your earthly nature. And how do you go about clothing yourself with those things that are godly? And take some time for prayer.